morning, beautiful people. It is great to be with you all today. I hope that you're all doing well. Brother Parks is over at one of the Canyon Churches of Christ, because there are a bunch of canyons over here, and I forget which one is which. No, North Valley, I think. He's someplace else. Anyway, so he'll be here next week. In the meantime, he asked me to fill in for him. So we're in Mark chapter 8. By now, you're aware that the theme of Mark is the suffering servant. In fact, in this chapter, Mark is going to begin to shift at the end of this chapter and really try and emphasize the suffering aspect of Jesus. Up to this point, it's been servant-oriented. So you might have noticed that throughout Mark up to this point, there's a lot of miracles, very little teaching in Mark. There's only a few parables that seem to pop up here and there, because Mark seems to be emphasizing the servant nature of Jesus, and so he shows all the miracles that Jesus does and his servant role within them. Also emphasizes the deity of Christ and his power over things, but it especially emphasizes his servant nature. But in this chapter, towards the end, he's going to start to shift a little bit and begin to emphasize the suffering aspect associated with that servant nature. So you'll notice the theme is suffering servant. If I can get somebody to read verses 1 through 9 of chapter 8. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. Oh, good. I get to pick. I like it when you guys let me do this. Let's see. Nelson, you made eye contact first, if you don't mind. Verses 1 through 9. Actually, verses 1 through 10. I forgot to put verse 10 in there. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, when you come across a name and you're really not sure how to pronounce it, just pronounce it confidently. Nobody else knows how to pronounce it either. So just make it sound like you know what you're talking about. This is the second feeding of a multitude. You might be familiar with there's a feeding of 5,000 and there's a feeding of a 4,000. Both Matthew and Mark record these two different feedings. Some try and suggest that they are just a retelling of the same feeding for some unknown reason. That for some reason somebody decided to retell the same feeding story twice. But there's enough differences to suggest otherwise. Not only the number of people, the amount of bread and fish that are present, the way the disciples interact, and Jesus will explicitly talk later in this chapter that don't you remember this feeding and this feeding. So there are two separate ones. But it kind of begs the question, why repeat a second feeding? We know that, or at least John talks in terms of, Jesus has a whole bunch of miracles, teaches a whole bunch of things, so much so that John will say that if everything had been recorded that Jesus did, if everything had been recorded that Jesus said, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to contain everything that was done. Which means that everything that is picked for a reason. Everything that's recorded is recorded for a reason. And so it kind of begs the question, why record a second feeding? When it's pretty clear that Jesus can make all this food appear. Why say it again? What do you think? Well, why record a second feeding? What do you think is important about it? Yes, sir? Okay, it does certainly emphasize this wasn't just simply a one-time thing. It wasn't as though, oh man, I hate to make this analogy, but I'm going to do it anyways. There are 3 Santa Claus movies, if you aren't aware of that. There are 3 of them. The first one's good, the second one's, and the third one's, but the second one, he has this little watch of power, and he can only use so much. And when it finally is all used up, then he's out of power. Well, Jesus isn't that way. It's not as though he had a limited amount of power and could only do a few things, and once he's done it all, then that's it. So it certainly does emphasize the limitless of Jesus' power. Okay. It does have a way of emphasizing the reach associated with it. I suspect the second one, and you wouldn't know this unless you happen to know about the Decapolis. The Decapolis is heavily Gentile. In fact, Matthew will emphasize a little bit more the Gentile nature of the surrounding areas associated with the 4,000. In which case, Jesus feeds a crowd in a location that is predominantly Jewish, and then he feeds a crowd in a location that is predominantly Gentile. And you can't help but wonder if there's some kind of message associated with the location of that feeding. The location being that Jesus wants to feed the needs and take care of the needs of both those who are Jewish and those who are Gentile. We could even extrapolate it just a little bit more, in that in Matthew, Jesus feeding the 5,000 seems to heavily emphasize the connection between him and Moses. Because you might remember that Moses also feeds a multitude in the wilderness, and both the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 are going to emphasize a desolate place, the midst of the wilderness. You might remember the manna that comes down from heaven in the midst of the wilderness with the Israelites as they're moving towards the promised land. And so there's this connection that is made that Jesus is able to feed just as Moses is able to feed. But John will make it clear that Jesus is the bread of life. Therefore, he is better than Moses, because Moses could only help bring about the feeding. He himself was not the bread. You get the idea. That seems to be the emphasis for the Jews. But for the Gentiles, who didn't have those stories, didn't know those stories, the emphasis seems to be that Jesus wants to do the same for the Gentiles that he wanted to do for the Jews. And there might be a third one. This one, I think there's something to it, but I don't think it's overt. Well, here's Jesus is not limited. We do see what seems to be maybe a beginning of growth of the disciples' faith. In John chapter 6, this is right before the feeding of the 5,000. Lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get even a little. Here, you might have noticed that there's an emphasis here in chapter 8, in verse 4. And the disciple answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" So there seems to be an emphasis not on, man, even if we had enough money, everybody couldn't even get a little bit of a bite. There seems to be a little bit of a growth, as though they remember that feeding of the 5,000, that, man, how are we going to feed everybody? How are we going to be able to fill everyone? As though they remembered that Jesus himself was able to fill the entire group. There seems to be maybe just a little bit of a growth of faith there. And the third being that Jesus came for the Gentiles as well. So there seems to be a reason behind this particular miracle. We'll also notice a difference between the basketfuls left over, or the amount left over in the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. By any chance, do you remember how much was left over, or how many vessels were there left over in the feeding of the 5,000? Do you remember? Say again? Yeah, it's 12. Now, why is 12 important? What is important? What is significant about a number of 12? Tribes specifically. There are disciples, but since Jesus is doing this amongst the Jews and seems to be trying to emphasize the connection with Moses, you can get to there's 12 tribes, as though Jesus has enough for all the 12 tribes. In fact, he has so much that there's a surplus. So even after feeding all those people, there's still plenty, enough for all of Israel, that he can feed the needs, take care of everyone of all of Israel. How many basketfuls are left in the feeding of the 4,000? Say again? 7. Does anybody happen to know any significance and notice associated with the number 7? perfection. It is the day of perfection, or it is the number perfection. You might notice with the seventh day that God makes it holy because he is perfect, and so therefore the day becomes perfect. Number 7 is often associated with perfection or holiness. So in this case, Jesus has enough to where there's a perfect amount left over, that even after having fed the Jews, even after having fed all the Gentiles, he's got enough for anything and everybody, the perfect amount, if you will. So Jesus is able to take care of the needs, able to feed the needs, able to take care of everything associated with all of the people everywhere and in all places. Yes, sir. Oh, okay, you just had your I'm thinking look. All right, if I can get somebody to read verses 11 through 13 for me, please. All right, thank you. What is the irony associated with this verse? What is the irony associated with the question that Jesus is being asked? Okay, he is the sign. So there's an element of irony there. What's another aspect of irony? He's already given a whole bunch. He's already done stuff in synagogues. Now, I don't know if the Pharisees were right there with him when he fed the 4,000, but they certainly heard about the feeding of the 5,000. They've already heard the signs. Some of them have seen the signs. Why? Because they're going to say, do you remember whenever they accused Jesus of casting out the demons by the power of Beelzebub? They couldn't dispute them. They knew they couldn't dispute them. They'd already seen the signs. So it kind of begs the question, well, why ask this time? Now, how is the question described by Mark? He uses a term to describe. They come, and he doesn't actually say they come and ask him a question. What does the text say? Because they are going to ask him a question. They are going to make a request of him, but how does Mark describe it? To test him. They didn't just come and make a request of him. They didn't come and ask him a question. They come to test him. Now, when you hear that idea of test, what comes to mind? Okay, a little bit of a catch and lie. It's interesting that the term test here is the same term that Mark is going to use earlier on for when Satan tempts Jesus in the wilderness, to test him. So it's not just a mere simple question here. What they're doing is with evil intent, trying to get him to do something. Now, I suspect there's a dual aspect here. One, trying to catch him in something that they could then point out. Oh, see, yep. But I can't help but wonder there's another aspect, because why that idea of test? There's something about faith. Something about having to trust what Jesus has done that endears us to God. There's something about faith that seems to endear us to him. And a sign perhaps of the magnitude that they seem to be requesting might very well impact some element of faith. If you didn't have faith about these things, so why this particular one as well? There seems to be something there associated with that as well. But ultimately, they seem to be trying to catch him in some way. If perhaps he'll do something so they can point out that he's done. You get the idea. And he tells them, nope, we're not going to do that. Now, Matthew will expound a little bit and express that Jesus does say there will be one actual sign, and that is the sign of Jonah, which will be his resurrection from the dead. In other words, Jesus says, I'm not going to give you any signs except for when I am raised from the dead. That will be the one that you've been looking for, which, for spoiler alert, they're going to miss that one too. All right. If I can get somebody to read verses 14 through 21. Again, Jesus emphasizes that there are two separate miracles that take place with the feedings, the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. What is leaven? It's a yeast. Now, in the Bible, leaven is going to be used multiple times. Do you happen to know what it represents? Usually the infiltration of sin or of evil, because if you've used yeast, you know you're trying to get it all throughout the dough, and you really can't see it, but you can kind of see its effects, right? It just kind of seems to mess with everything, and once it's in there, it's really kind of hard to get out. If you've ever tried doing it, it's really stinking hard. I tried, it doesn't work. Usually leaven is referencing this idea of sin, or this idea of at least evil intent. So what exactly is Jesus trying to convey in this particular teaching with his disciples? What do you think? What is he trying to convey? Because he doesn't just simply say, beware of leaven. What does he say? To beware of the teaching, we might even say beware of the attitude that's associated with it. To beware of the attitude, the teaching that is there, because once it works its way in, it's going to be very difficult to do anything with. It's going to just kind of remain. Okay? To not follow, to not be like them. How would you, because we can kind of understand how the disciples make the connection they do. They're human. And they are concerned because they haven't brought bread. And if you've ever not had something that you really knew you should have had, and somebody happens to mention something, even tangentially related, you just can't help but think about the one thing, like, oh my goodness, they know. So in this case, the disciples know that they're without the bread that they really should have gotten. Since they don't have it, Jesus mentions that about leaven. Immediately their mind goes to a thing they've already been talking about, and how can we not do this? And now they are beginning completely distracted, completely unaware of what Jesus is trying to say. How would you describe Jesus' response to what I presume to be their quiet mutterings amongst themselves? How would you describe his response if you had to summarize it? Okay, do you still not understand? All right. Any other way that we might summarize it? Okay, there's some similarities with, my goodness, have you guys not gotten it yet? And I've wondered what the tone of voice was associated with what Jesus says. Like, is he exasperated? Because he does reference the miracles that have already taken place. And he doesn't just reference all the miracles. He references the two about bread of, really guys, haven't you learned by now I can make bread appear? It's okay that you didn't bring bread. I wonder if there was exasperation. I wonder if there was resignation. I'm not really sure what the tone of voice was. It does seem to be perhaps just a little bit on the rebuking side. What else does he reference besides bread as he responds to his disciples? Because he's going to reference two other things, specifically about physical qualities. What else does he reference? What was that, Miss Brenda? I can read your lips. I think you said seeing and hearing. Told you I could. Seeing and hearing. I want you to keep those two things in mind. For those of you who might remember, at the end of chapter 7, I don't think we got there last week, at the end of chapter 7, Jesus is going to heal a man who cannot hear. I want you to keep the idea of seeing and hearing in mind as we get ready for the next miracle that Jesus is going to do. Remember, Jesus here, I'm going to say chastises, because I think he kind of does that a little bit here, chastises his disciples. Do you not see yet? Do you not hear yet? You've already been with me for 2 times whenever I made bread appear out of nowhere. And you're afraid that we're not going to be able to do that again. So I want you to keep that idea of hearing and seeing in mind as we move to verses 22 through 26. And they came to Bethesda, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he spit on the man's eyes, laid his hands on him. And he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and opened his eyes, and sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." I want us to do a little bit of group work. By that, we're going to go do group 1, group 2, group 3. You guys have done this with me before. I want you to discuss this particular miracle, and I really want you to answer 2 questions. The first is, why does it take 2 tries? To my knowledge, there is no other miracle that Jesus does where he has to do it twice. Does he just have a power failure? Do things just not quite go right the first time? Did the other guy, like when you're getting a haircut, the barber tells you to hold still, did he not hold still? I don't know. So what do you think? Why does it take 2 times? Well, what is the point of the miracle? What is trying to be emphasized? Why 2 times? And the second thing I want you to discuss is, how does this miracle relate to the overall context? You might be aware that in the original writing, when Mark put paper to pen, put pen to paper, right? Yeah, when Mark put pen to paper, there are no chapter distinctions, there are no headings, there are no verses. We add those later, and there's nothing wrong with that. We add those later to make things easier to find. But sometimes we kind of miss the flow, we read it in terms of sections. When every once in a while we might miss a bit of flow that's trying to make a point. And then earlier we talked about that John makes it clear that the gospel writers picked certain miracles, picked certain teachings to try and emphasize something. So with those 2 ideas in mind, that it was meant to be read as an entire, that it was meant to be read as one flowing idea, recognizing that Mark picks certain things for a specific purpose, that means he's picked this one in an overall context for a reason. So what do you think this miracle has on the bearing of the overall context? So what I'm asking you to do is, what's going on in this miracle? Why 2 tries? And how does this miracle relate to the overall context of what is taking place here in Mark chapter 8? Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? Once, twice, thrice. All right. You got just a few minutes, group 1, group 2, group 3, and then we'll discuss. know it wasn't enough time. I told you I was going to give you a few minutes, but we've got to try and discuss it. Sorry. Group one, I know I'm cutting you off because I can still see you're trying to talk, but hopefully you at least made it through the first question. I'm curious, in your mind, why are there 2 tries to heal? Why does it take 2 tries? What do you think? Okay. 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 Okay, so your suggestion is that the miracle is less about the miracle and more about the disciples. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Group 2, what do you think? Why does it take 2 tries? I mean, they all just toss you underneath the bus. Did you even see it coming? Why do you think that? Why do you think that he didn't have the faith? Okay. 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 Curious. Why does the blind man come to Jesus initially? He doesn't actually come. Now, there's a contrast here between him and blind Bartimaeus. You might remember blind Bartimaeus says, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Everybody tells him, "You need to really shut up," right? At which point he just starts yelling louder, right? So there's clearly an element of faith on his part as to who Jesus is. In this case, this man only shows up because other friends said, "All right, you got to go." And he's blind. He didn't have a choice, right? So off he goes. And that kind of makes you wonder, is Jesus doing something intentionally for his faith? Of doing it just a little bit so this guy begin to realize, oh, and to try and make it clear and try and draw out his faith in the process. So maybe that's why. So how does that relate to the overall context? Okay. Maybe there's an aspect of this. So maybe there's a dual aspect. There's the initial miracle and what takes place within it and how it relates overall. Okay. What do you guys think? She had the answer, so we're going to go with ditto. Oh, Steve has it. Sorry, I heard she. I was confused too. All right. Okay. 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 All right. So I hear you emphasizing how it relates to the apostles. Is that correct? All right. So we have two who are kind of picking up on, there seems to be an emphasis upon the apostles, or at this point the disciples. They'll come to be called apostles later on. But at this point, the disciples. And that does seem to fit their overall context. You might have remembered that when they're in the boat discussing bread, Jesus tells them, can you not see? Can you not hear? Trying to emphasize that. Now, before I get to the overall context, I do think that something does take place within the miracle itself. It seems as though there is a miracle, something to be learned from there, and then Mark will relate that to the overall context and the theme he's trying to draw out. In this case, it seems to be the idea of growing faith, of trying to grow this individual man's faith who does not come to Jesus on his own, but only comes to Jesus because other people brought him. And then Jesus heals him in a way that would have grown his faith. would have let him know this is what's going on. Jesus is the one who is drawing this out and trying to increase his faith in the process. But how does that relate to overall context? And I think you guys already picked up on it. That anytime we see themes repeated, there's usually a reason. And one of the themes that exists in all of the Gospels, but in Mark's as well, is the blindness of the disciples. That they didn't really see. Not well anyways. They don't really exactly see who Jesus is. And with the two miracles, they've already not fully seen. Like they've seen him, and there seems to be maybe a glimmer with the second miracle of instead of, man, nobody's even going to be able to take a bite to eat of, how would we make everybody full like we did last time? They seem to be remembering and maybe getting a little bit of a glimmer there, and then all at the same time, man, now we don't have any bread. So okay, maybe they can see, but then maybe not. If we look at the next two, and we're about out of time, so we're not going to have time to read them. If we look at the rest of the chapter, the next thing that's going to happen is Peter's confession. You might remember that Jesus is going to ask, and he asks in more than one gospel, who do men say that I am? And you might remember some of the responses. Some say he's one of the prophets. Some say he's Elijah. A major character, major godly character, even at times someone connected with a messianic expectation. Because they picked up on that Jesus is an important person, that he's able to do things that only God would allow him to do, that he must be from God, he must be part of the messianic expectation idea. Yet none of the reported statements are that he's the Messiah. And then Peter's going to say, but you are the Christ. Now in Matthew he adds, you are the Christ, the Son of God. But either way, you are the Christ, and you might know that Jesus Christ is Jesus the Christ. It's not that Jesus has a first name and a last name. It's Jesus the Messiah or Jesus the Christ. And so what Peter's saying is you are the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. This great glimmer of, man, they finally got it. And then in the very next section, Jesus is going to say, now, let me tell you, the Messiah's got to go die. At which point Peter loses his mind and goes up to Jesus and says, no, you will not. You will not do such a thing. Such a thing will not happen. And you might remember where Jesus then tells him, get behind me, Satan. That we see this great arc of Peter of going from this huge mountaintop moment of, you're the Christ, yes, you're right, you got it. All of a sudden to, man, get behind me, Satan. Now, there's this great change. This moment where Peter's got it, and then he doesn't. Where he can kind of see, because he's recognized this is the Messiah, the Christ. But none of them really understood what the Messiah was to do, who the Messiah was to be. That there were a lot of expectations as to what Messiah would do. Some thought he'd be a military leader. Some thought he'd be a priest that restored the temple the way it was supposed to be. Some thought it'd be a mixture of both. Some thought there'd be three Messiahs. Nobody knew. But in all the stories, the Messiah wasn't supposed to die, especially not on the cross. And Jesus here tells them, after they finally got the truth that he is the Messiah, the Christ, they finally got it, and he tells them, now I'm going to go die. And they, whoa, that doesn't make any sense. It's like they had it, and they didn't. Like they could kind of see, like this blind man who can see and see well enough to see things moving around, but he's like, yeah, that's not the way it's supposed to be. He can get a glimmer, but not fully see yet. And Jesus is helping the disciples come to fully see, and eventually they will after his resurrection. And they'll be able to look back and they'll see everything clearly as it was supposed to be. And this leads me to a question. Both the Pharisees and the disciples are blind, at least at this point. Neither can see Jesus for who he really is, exactly as he is, exactly for what he will do. So what's the difference? Both are blind. What's the difference between the Pharisees and the disciples? What do you think? Say again? Okay, there's an element of motivation. Any other differences? Where are the disciples? That's the difference. The disciples kept coming to Jesus, wanting to try and understand. They didn't get it. Now, there is an element of that coming to him is motivated because they want to know, and the Pharisees are so blind and hard-hearted because they don't want to know, and they want to see him fail. There's an element of that. But the disciples keep coming to Jesus, which allows Jesus to help them be able to see, because we can only see through Jesus. Jesus is the one who helps us to see. At the end of the chapter, he's going to end with the statement that many of us might recognize. that he would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. We've heard that statement before, the idea of take up your cross. But in the first century, it wouldn't have made any sense at all. Because the cross is the epitome of horror. It is an entity that they had to make up a word to describe what it does. Excruciating comes from the pain associated with the cross. They had to make up a word to try and describe what the cross did. And they came up with the word excruciating. The idea that you would carry that around with you, you only did that if you were going to go die. You don't do that. And you certainly don't pick it up every day. That's something you want to avoid. So Jesus is going to turn everything on its head in a way that doesn't exactly make sense. What does it mean to take up your cross? I want us to end with this. What does it mean to take up your cross? You don't have to answer it. It's rhetorical. Because whatever you say today, I bet if we went back 20 years earlier, I bet your answer would be different. And if we could jump in our time machine and jump 20 years in the future, I bet your answer would be different then too. Because as we grow closer to Christ, the more time we spend in his presence, the more we allow him to work on our eyes so that we might see, the more we come to understand not only who he is, but what it means to follow him. The more we come to understand what it means to take up my cross and follow him. And what I understand it to mean today is likely not going to be what I understand it to mean 10 years in the future if I'm in the presence of Christ and continually trying to learn from him, for he is the one who helps me not only to see, but to see as I'm supposed to see. But it requires that I be in his presence. It requires that I continually keep coming to him, recognizing that I can't yet see as I need to be able to see. That yes, this is about the disciples, but it's also about me, and it's also about you. Because we too have a glimmer of who Christ is, can kind of see him a little bit, or we wouldn't be following him, but I would bet anything that we don't see him exactly as he is just yet. But as we continue to come to him, we get a better view of who he is as we allow him to help us to see more. But the difference is continually coming to him. Thank you guys for being here today. Let's pray and we'll wrap up. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word. We're so thankful for your Son and your Spirit. I'm so thankful that for your patience as you help us to see not only you as you are, but what it means to follow you and what it means to live for you. But we ask you help us to glorify you in all we do. We love and can't wait to be with you in Christ's name.